Hi, uh, good afternoon. Today I would like to. Today is October 25, and on this day, on 1951, the first elections were held in India. The general elections were held in India, and a lot of people got the right to vote. The adults above 21 years got the right to vote, and it is called the Universal Adult Franchise. Uh, and this was given a right after independence, and this is something quite unique to Indian democracy compared to other Western democracies. And this is unique because the Western democracies like US and Britain, when they had become democracies, when they called themselves democracies either after independence or after passing certain laws, they would not give they would not become a total democracy. By this, what I mean is that not all the people would be given a right to vote among the adults. It would only happen gradually as the decades pass by. After a long number of years, that the entire adult population would get a right to vote. uh, so but with India, right after independence, the entire adult population about 21 years of age got the right to vote. So it is something unique, and I'll tell you in this video why it is unique. Before that, I would like to talk about give you some background as to how the concept of state had evolved from the ancient times to the medieval to the present, and evolved into a democracy in the first place. So first, let me start with that background. Firstly, during the ancient times and during the medieval times, the role of state was primarily to provide security to the people within that kingdom or the state by the king or the nobles who would be protecting that state. And by security, I mean internal as well as external security. External security from invaders who would probably plunder, who would slaughter the population, and uh, and would also enslave a large section of population. So it was due to this fear that there was a need for external security and internal security to maintain law and order within the realms of the kingdom. To actually prove this point, I have an example. The example I told you that this kind of security was provided by the state, and it was a predominant kind of security because in the ancient and the medieval times, uh, and for this I have an example. Let me take you to a time in the medieval times in the 17th century. One would find that 70 to 90% of of the of the budget of the government of the Western democracies or the European democracy specifically was dominated by military. What this essentially suggests is that most of the ancient and the medieval states have been military states. It does not mean that they have not cared about the welfare of the people. They did care, but that took the back seat. As one goes ahead in time from the ancient to medieval to the modern times, at the beginning of the modern times, in the 19th century, there would be industrial revolution in Britain, and uh, and this was the time when there was mass production of goods and services. So at this time, there was, according to the what can be observed if one reads the world history, one could observe that the role of state started shifting. The role of state started gradually shifting from just providing security to its population to facilitating economic growth. So this actually happened because there are many reasons why this shift of the role of state happened. And one reason is that because there was mass production of goods and services and it was being produced cheaply, there was a great deal of advantage in facilitating this growth, because that would increase the wealth of a nation. And once that happens, the government can impose large sums of taxes on people, and the government itself will get a large revenue which it can use to further increase its uh, military spending. So essentially, there was this thought process when the government gradually changed from providing just security to facilitating economic growth. And for facilitating economic growth, the government also required to spend money, and for that it required some money, and it would not only get that money from tax revenues but also by borrowing from the banks or by issuing financial products. So once the money is set, the government would facilitate the economic growth. And how would it do that? It would spend in the infrastructure of the nation. And why spending in the infrastructure of the nation would facilitate an economic growth? That was the question. And to answer this, let me just go ahead and say that the governments, the Western democracies, had started providing roads, started providing ports, railways, sanitation, sewerage. What all this does is the independent business owners who would set up their factories and industries would be attracted to a place, would be attracted to a land which will have all these facilities, because it would make it easy for them uh, to produce goods profitably, produce goods and services profitably. And therefore there was this attraction value from the business owners to go to that land wherever there is public investment. Not only that, this would also enrich the people who own the land, because once there is infrastructure in that land, people who are owning the land would rent this land out to the heavy demand from the business people to set up their factories, heavy demand from the capitalists to set up their factories. So therefore, the landowning class also benefits because of infrastructure, public investment by the government. The government benefits because it can later impose high taxes from the high growth on the people and achieve good tax revenues, which it can use for its military spending, as well as to pay back the money it had borrowed from the banks or issued through the financial products. It could pay back using that newly enriched wealth of the newly enriched country or a government or a nation. So there were all these advantages which came with the Industrial Revolution because of the mass production which started in Britain in the 19th century. Added to that was the public investment. So Industrial Revolution plus the public investment had caused the wealth of the Western democracies, the European countries, to go up. The GDP per capita would go up like never before in the history of the world until that point. All this was enriching the wealth of a nation, but there was one glaring defect that was left out, and it was the fact that the wealth that was generated was only benefiting certain groups of a society, and that group included the landowning class, it included the capitalist class, and it included the people who were educated or professionals, but not to the other large section of the population which made up the country, which included women, minorities, poor people, the workers. The wealth generated would not benefit them. I told you that the wealth generated during the Industrial Revolution, in addition, when added with the public investment, would go to the landowning class, because the land value will go up as there would be public infrastructure, there will be businesses that would be attracted to that land, and more businesses would take that land, and the landowners would get high rents. The professional class would which include the capitalists and the people who invest and the entrepreneurs, would also benefit, not only because of the large scale production which was achieved in the Industrial Revolution, but also from the public investment by the government. But the large section of the population which would be left out, that is the poor people, the workers who work in the factories, the minorities, the women, would not get the benefits or the wealth generated by that nation, because of the change of the government's role gradually towards providing public investment. So, as this glaring defect became more and more prominent, the Western countries had also become wealthy while this happened. So, what they could do, because because they had become wealthy, the government could afford to tax people more, and they could gradually also have another role of redistributing the wealth of the nation to the large section of the population where there is inequality. But this happened only after the wealth of that nation had increased. So this happened only in the last 100 or so years. So until then, it was only the role of the government was restricted only primarily to two main things. One was to provide security in the form of law and order internally, law and order security internally, as well as external security, and the other one, which had come about after the Industrial Revolution, was to provide public investment and public goods. The third role of the state that would come up only after the Western democracies or the European democracies would become rich, or at least the middle income countries, would be the redistribution of the wealth that is generated by taxing people more to the larger underprivileged section of the population. And the pattern that would be observed if one reads through the history is that uh, the role of the government shifts towards giving welfare to the people only when the large underprivileged section of the population would be given a right to vote. I must tell you one thing here. After the Western democracies had become independent, had become democracies, they only gave the right to vote to a very small section of the population, and that section was that which would own land, which would own properties, and which would be generally educated, and this included the landowning class and the capitalist class. So that was quite a small section of the population, and the governments which were elected because of this population would be those governments which would provide public investment and which would eventually benefit only that small section of the population which voted the government. Essentially, that small section, privileged section, who got the right to vote would vote a government that would provide them public services, public goods, and public investment. And therefore, because of that, the wealth of that nation, of the Western democracies, would go up initially. In that sense, despite calling themselves democracy, it was only a small section that got the right to vote initially, and because of that, those countries would grow rich first, or at least a middle income country, and after that, only after that, in the last 100 years or so, would these countries be able to afford the costly welfare schemes that were provided to the large section, other section of the population, which initially did not have the right to vote, because of which they could not vote a government which would provide them welfare services. So once and the government's shift of the role from a well from a role from giving security and then as as a facilitator of the growth, and then as a welfare state, had evolved almost when the government started giving the right to the large underprivileged section of the population, the poor, the women, the minorities, the workers of the industries. And it is this large section that would vote such governments which would provide welfare to them. So essentially, when the government I would also like to tell you when exactly there was a gradual shift from not only facilitating growth by the governments, but also to provide welfare. And with regard to the Western democracies, this happened after the Great Depression in the 1930s. This happened after the Second World War ended, after the 1950s. And this would kind of happen uh, initially after the war, or during the war and before the war, the tax revenues of such governments, the Western democracies, would go up because they have to finance the military, and even after the war, the taxes were kept high so that that money could be used for redistribution into the economy. And that is when the gradual shift occurred from just facilitation of the growth by the government to the redistribution of wealth. It was after the Great Depression, as well as after the end of the Second World War, that there was a gradual shift, and ultimately these Western European democracies would, right now in the present date, would spend around 20 to 30% of their GDP on welfare. So essentially, looking into history, what one can see, what one can look as, is that there is a pattern that has developed. The pattern was initially, from the ancient times to the medieval times, the role of the state was only to provide security, so that people are safe from invaders, safe from the plunder of their countries or kingdoms, safe from getting slaughtered, safe from being enslaved by the conquerors, and also to ensure that the civil war does not occur. There would be the law and order that would be provided by the kings and the nobles in the ancient and the medieval times. Gradually, with the Industrial Revolution, public investment was added, and then after the Great Depression and World War II, there would be the role of the state to provide welfare to the people. And the pattern here that one observes is, it is only during the 1920s, 1930s that the states begin to completely give the right to vote to the underprivileged section, the poor, the workers, the women, and the minority sections. And only at this time, uh, and by this time, the Western democracies had already grown rich, because the people who had the right to vote initially voted such governments which would improve only economic growth and give benefits to the landowning class, give benefits to the people who owned property, give benefits to the people who were capitalists, give benefits to people who were educated. So once they had grown rich, it is a fact that welfare spending is very costly. It's very expensive. And despite being expensive, because they were rich, because they were at least middle income countries, these European democracies and the Western democracies, they were able to afford such kind of spending. And it so happened that when there was this shift, uh, the voting rights was also extended to the underprivileged sections, which which would vote such governments which would provide them welfare. One can also question now that if the government had not provided welfare um, before, uh, even if the government had not provided welfare when voting was only restricted to the landowning class, the property owning class, the educated people, the capitalists, wouldn't it have been possible that the wealth generated by the nation, okay, uh, could be could also be distributed among the poor automatically? Like, for example, uh, because there is large scale production of goods and services, the prices of the goods and services would come down, and this would automatically help the poor because the prices are cheap. And secondly, there would also be a large number of jobs because of production of large number of goods and services, and this would also benefit the poor. One could also think in such lines, but the problem with such a thinking is that to provide growth, the investment that is needed from the government, the infrastructure that is provided from the government, takes a long time. It takes a long time for the companies, the business persons, to research on the topics, research on producing such goods and services which would be cheap and which could be produced in large quantities. Therefore, so in a sense, what that means is just providing for economic growth would not automatically mean that it would also spill over to the rest of the population, which is a little disadvantaged, because it would take a long time. In the long run, it will definitely help that underprivileged large section of population that does not benefit from the economic growth in the short run. But in the short run, there would be inequalities that would prevail, and to plug these inequalities, the Western democracies or the European democracies had an advantage of of already having been rich from the economic growth, or at least a middle income country, to be able to spend in the costly welfare schemes. And now this is the background with regard to the Western democracies like US, UK, and other European countries like Netherlands and Spain. But now let me come to India and tell you how India's universal adult franchise, the right to vote given to the entire section of the population, initially people who are about 21 years old, was unique. As I already told you that the I think you must have already guessed, as I already told you, the Western democracies would only spend in the welfare schemes once the underprivileged section of the population got the right to vote. They would only spend once they had already become rich, or when the underprivileged section of the population did not have the right to vote in the past, and it was only the landed class, the capitalists, the educated people who had the right to vote. And once they had become rich, they would spend that wealth on the redistribution of the wealth in the form of welfare schemes. But in the case of India, right after independence, all the people, all the adults about 21 years of age were given a right to vote. And now what that meant is uh, India had totally become a democracy right from independence, whereas the Western democracies like US and UK would would only become democracies gradually. As they become richer and richer, they would become more and more democratic. Let me tell you, for example, United States became independent in 1776, but the entire adult population got the right to vote only in 1965 comprehensively. Britain had become a democracy in 1832, and the entire adult population, the universal adult franchise, was given on to its population only in 1929 and 28. So with regard to India, India was independent in 1947, but the entire population, the adult population, would have the right to vote by 1951, by the time of the first general elections. So this is the uniqueness. The uniqueness is Indian democracy had become a total democracy just in one go, whereas the Western democracies had time, had years, hundreds of years before they became rich, before they would allow the entire population to vote, and and that population and that population would ultimately vote such governments which would give them welfare schemes. And even when that happened, even when the such governments are elected, they have enough money, because by that time the Western democracies had already become rich and middle income countries. So one can also say that Western democracies were not total democracies at the initial phases of their economic growth. They took years and years before becoming a democracy, though they called themselves democracy at their inception. So since today is October 25th, the day on which the first general election occurred and the entire population of India got the right to vote, since I wanted to talk about the universal adult franchise and its uniqueness with regard to India, I had to bring this point about total democracy provided by our constitution makers to the Indian people. I hope you found this interesting. Thank you very much.